If you were sitting alone in an empty church and heard the low growl of something not quite human, would you run or walk toward it? It was the dead of winter in rural Montana, and the snow fell so heavily that even prayers seemed to vanish in the hush. Inside St. Joseph's Chapel, an aging structure of wood and stone, the pews were empty, except for one man seated in the back row, eyes closed, lips moving silently. His name was Harold Baines, 71, retired park ranger, widowed for 6 years. He came here every morning at dawn, not for the sermons. They'd stopped years ago, but for the silence, the stillness, the only place that didn't echo with her absence. That morning, something felt different. He'd barely closed his eyes when the doors creaked open, not with wind or human touch, but with something heavier, slower. A dragging sound followed, then a low, guttural breath. Harold turned, expecting maybe a dog or injured deer from the forest beyond the hill. But what stood in the aisle wasn't that. It was a lioness, massive, emaciated, eyes wild and sunken. Her fur was coated in snow and dried blood. Her paws left faint smudges of red on the church's stone floor. She took 2 steps, staggered, and collapsed beneath the crucifix at the altar. For a second, Harold thought his grief had finally turned into madness. But the lioness was real and she was breathing, barely. She didn't roar, she didn't threaten, she just lay there trembling, like something sacred had broken inside her. Harold's first instinct was to stay frozen. This was not a creature that belonged in a sanctuary built by man. But there was something in her eyes, something hollow and pleading, not the wild fury of a predator, but the haunted silence of a soul that had seen too much. Outside, the wind howled against the stained glass. The town was 30 miles away, and the road had iced over. Harold had no cell phone, no radio, and no idea how a lioness ended up on a Montana hillside. But something in him stirred. The part that once rescued eagles from poachers and led orphaned bear cubs back to the safety of the wild. That man had died with his wife, but now he felt him stirring again. The lioness raised her head slightly, her gaze locking with Harold's. Neither moved, neither needed to. For months, Harold had been drifting. His children rarely called, the ranger station was long gone, and most mornings felt like echoes of the one before. The grief had settled into his bones like frost. He had spent 6 winters alone in this chapel, trying to hear his wife's voice again in the silence. But now the silence had been broken, not by ghosts, but by a dying beast that should not be here. Yet somehow, it was absurd. It was terrifying. It was divine. He moved slowly. Not toward her, but toward the altar, keeping his eyes on her, his hands open. She didn't flinch. She was too far gone. Her breathing came in shallow pulls. A thin line of blood trickled from her flank. Harold saw that her ribs were visible, her muscles wasted. She had been running from something. Hunters, traffickers, or maybe like him from the world itself. Whatever it was, it had nearly killed her. A small clatter echoed as Harold knocked over a candle holder with his boot. The lioness twitched but didn't rise. She didn't have the strength. A strange understanding formed in the air between them, heavier than fear. She wasn't here to harm. She had come here the same way Harold did each morning, seeking peace in the only place left untouched, somewhere safe enough to die. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing the world beyond the windows. No cars, no calls, no help coming. It was just the old man and the dying lioness, both drawn to the same sanctuary. Harold looked at her again. Really looked. And for the first time in 6 years, something cracked open in his chest. Not fear, not even pity, but a quiet urgency. She needed help, and he, for once, had a reason to stand again. He stepped down from the altar and knelt just a few feet from her, slowly lowering his coat to the floor. Her eyes followed him, but didn't challenge. There was no growl, no baring of teeth, just a low, pained breath. Harold laid the coat over her shivering body, the fabric barely covering her massive frame. She didn't resist. She let him. Somewhere, a floorboard creaked. A raven called outside. Inside, time stopped. Then it happened. The lioness made a sound. Not a roar, not a whimper, but something like a sigh. as if she'd finally reached the end of a long, brutal road. Harold placed his hand, trembling, on her shoulder. Her fur was coarse, matted with ice and blood. His fingers pressed gently against the pulse behind her ear. Faint, but there. She was still alive. And Harold, who had once let everything die inside him, whispered 3 words to no one and everyone at once. "You're not alone." Harold sat beside her, the stone floor biting into his knees, but he didn't move. The lioness didn't either. She blinked slowly, each breath sounding like it cost her more than the last. Harold's coat clung to her frame like a child's blanket on a dying warrior. He could feel her warmth fading through the fabric, as if her body had given up long before her spirit had. He leaned in closer, ignoring every instinct that told him to stay back. Her wound looked deep, just below her ribs, likely a bullet, though no exit wound was visible. The smell of metal and rot told him it had been there for days. Harold had seen this kind of injury before. Years ago, while tracking poachers in the Dakota Plains, he'd found a wounded cougar with a similar wound. Infection had set in then too, and that cat hadn't made it through the night. The memory returned in brutal detail, and with it, Harold's pulse quickened. This lioness didn't have much time. She needed antibiotics, she needed warmth, she needed food, water, shelter. And all he had was a decades-old chapel and a stubborn heart that still knew how to fight for a life. The rational thing would have been to stay back, wait for daylight, maybe flag someone down on the old highway in the morning. But something in the lioness's breathing, in her willingness to let him touch her, made Harold reject the rational. If he waited, she would die. If he left her alone for too long, she would fade into the silence, just like his wife had. Quietly, slowly, with no one there to witness the last breath. That was the part Harold couldn't accept. Not again. He grabbed one of the altar cloths, an old linen from a forgotten Easter Mass, and soaked it in water from the font. He gently dabbed around the wound, careful not to press too hard. The lioness winced but didn't retaliate. Her paw flexed, claws twitching slightly. Her muscles flinched, but she let him do it. Each movement was an act of insane trust. Neither of them had a reason to believe in each other, and yet here they were, man and beast, both long past the point of pretending they didn't need something more. Time moved strangely in the chapel. The light outside began to dim, and the soft color of evening snow crept through the stained glass. Harold rummaged through the back room, finding an old space heater, some canned soup, and a metal bowl. He poured water into the bowl and set it near her muzzle. She sniffed it, then licked slowly, then greedily, as if her throat had been burning for hours. He almost laughed. It was ridiculous. It was beautiful. She was drinking holy water from a place where once people had knelt in prayer. The risk was staggering. If anyone found out, Harold could be charged for harboring a wild animal, especially one this dangerous. The lioness was likely an escapee from an illegal exotic breeding operation. He'd heard rumors about a busted truck weeks ago near the state line. 2 big cats missing. One had been found shot on a ranch. This one must have kept running until she collapsed here. If the authorities caught wind of her presence, she'd be tranquilized, caged, or worse, they'd kill her. Harold knew it in his bones. His old ranger instincts kicked in. He dragged 3 benches together to form a barrier, not to cage her, but to offer some comfort, some boundary between her and the world. He pulled the old choir robes from a cedar chest and layered them around her like nesting. With each gesture, he remembered the rituals of caretaking. They'd grown dusty inside him, but they were still there. He hadn't forgotten how to save something that wanted to live. Harold sat down again beside her. Her breathing had evened slightly. Her eyes remained open, watching him. He spoke softly, barely louder than the wind against the chapel doors. "You're not supposed to be here," he murmured. "But then again, neither am I." The lioness blinked once. He didn't know what she understood, but something passed between them. A shared truth, wordless and ancient. They were both survivors, both ghosts in a world that had moved on. That night, Harold didn't leave. He made a bed from a pile of hymnals and old cushions. The church, once cold and forgotten, felt like a living place again. Not because of prayers, but because of presence. He stayed awake, watching her chest rise and fall. Every breath she took pulled something out of him. Grief, regret, loneliness, and left behind something quieter. Something almost like peace. He hadn't touched his wife's side of the bed since her passing. But now, beside this dying lioness, he felt closer to the living than he had in years. In the early hours, the storm picked up. The snow began to pile against the door. A tree branch cracked and fell just beyond the chapel steps. Still, Harold didn't move. He held a battered flashlight in one hand and a half-empty bottle of aspirin in the other. He stared at the lioness, then at the cross above her head. It wasn't faith he felt. It was duty. A kind of calling older than scripture, one he couldn't ignore anymore. Harold made his decision. He would save her no matter the cost. He couldn't walk away again. By sunrise, the storm had buried the chapel under nearly 2 feet of snow. The world outside looked erased, as if nothing else existed beyond those walls. Inside, the lioness was still alive, barely. Her breathing had grown raspy, and she trembled despite the makeshift bedding Harold had wrapped around her. He knew he had to do more. The infection was spreading fast, and without antibiotics or real medical care, she wouldn't survive the day. But the nearest vet was over 30 miles away, and none of them were prepared to treat a lion. Still, Harold had one last card to play. Years ago, he'd trained with wildlife veterinarians during a poaching crisis overseas. He wasn't certified, but he remembered enough. And more importantly, he knew someone who owed him a favor. Dr. Louise Kramer, a retired vet who once ran a wildlife rescue out of Bozeman. They hadn't spoken in a decade, not since her husband died. But Harold picked up the church's dusty landline and prayed it still worked. It took 6 rings, a click, and a groggy hello before he exhaled. "Louise," he said, "it's Harold. I need your help. It's urgent." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Harold, are you all right?" His voice cracked. "I'm not. But it's not for me. There's a lioness. She's hurt. In the chapel." Another pause, longer this time. "You're telling me there's a lion in a church?" "Yes," he said, "and she's dying." Louise didn't ask how or why. She just said, "Give me 2 hours." He gave her directions, though he doubted her truck could make it through the snow. But she always was stubborn. Maybe more than he was. While he waited, Harold cleaned the wound again, using boiled water and every bit of gauze he could find from the old first aid kits. The lioness flinched less now, though he could see the pain hadn't lessened. He whispered to her constantly, telling her stories about the forest, about his wife, about the stars, anything to keep her tethered. She blinked slowly in response, sometimes letting her head fall against his hand. She was weakening, but something about his presence seemed to keep her holding on. Around noon, headlights pierced the snowdrift outside the chapel. Louise appeared like an angel out of legend. Parka, boots, and 2 duffel bags full of supplies. She didn't hesitate. She stepped inside, looked at the lioness, then at Harold. "You weren't kidding," she said. "She's in bad shape. Can you help her?" he asked. Louise knelt beside the lioness, feeling along her flank, checking the wound. "If we work fast, maybe, but she needs antibiotics, fluids, and real warmth." They worked in tandem. Louise administered an injection, set up an IV using a coat rack and some tubing, and together they lifted her onto a mattress they'd dragged in from the old priest's quarters. It was surreal. 2 retirees treating a dying apex predator in a snowed-in chapel, but neither commented on the strangeness of it. Their hands moved with purpose. Their voices stayed calm. And for the first time, Harold felt that, just maybe, this lioness had a chance. As they worked, Harold saw something shift in Louise too. Her eyes softened. Her voice grew steadier. She hadn't left her property in months, not since closing her practice. But here she was, saving a creature most people would fear. "She's beautiful," Louise whispered. "And strong. She must have come a long way." Harold nodded. "So have we." And in that moment, they both understood. This wasn't just about the lioness. It was about redemption, about purpose returning in the most unexpected form. By late afternoon, the lioness was stable. Her temperature had risen slightly. Her breathing evened out. She even lifted her head briefly to drink more water. Louise smiled for the first time in years. She's a fighter. Harold placed a hand on the lioness's mane, careful not to press too hard. She reminds me of someone I used to know. Louise looked at him, then at the chapel around them. This place, it feels alive again. Harold nodded. Because we're here, and because maybe some things are still worth saving. That evening, Louise decided to stay the night. The snow made leaving impossible anyway. They built a fire in the old stone hearth using broken pew wood and scraps. The lioness lay curled near the warmth, her body still weak but her eyes more alert. Harold watched her as if watching over a miracle. And in some ways, that's what she was. Not divine in the traditional sense, but sacred in her resilience. A creature that had no reason to trust, yet allowed herself to be helped. The wind outside softened. The chapel lights flickered. Harold poured Louise a cup of black coffee from the ancient percolator and sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder. "You ever think you'd end up here again?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "Not like this. But I'm glad I did." The lioness shifted slightly in her sleep, letting out a soft breath that sounded almost like relief. Harold leaned back, letting the silence settle around them. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt full of life, of purpose, of second chances. As the fire crackled and the storm passed, Harold realized something. He wasn't waiting to die anymore. Not in this place. Not while there was still something or someone to fight for. The lioness had brought him back, not with roars or power, but by lying down in front of him and asking for help. She didn't just survive, she gave him a reason to as well. And now, as sleep tugged at his eyes, Harold let himself believe in tomorrow again. The storm cleared by morning, leaving a glassy sheet of ice over everything beyond the chapel walls. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting soft hues of red and gold across the lioness's fur. She lay stretched near the hearth, no longer shivering, eyes open, alert. Her wound was still healing, but the infection had begun to retreat thanks to Louise's care. Harold moved quietly, checking the IV, changing her bandage. Every small task felt sacred now, a morning ritual in a new kind of church. For the first time in 6 years, he rose with purpose. Louise called in some favors, quiet ones, people who knew how to keep things off the record. A local sanctuary run by ex-conservationists agreed to take the lioness in once she was stable. No zoo, no cage, just land, privacy, and respect. It wasn't legal in the traditional sense, but it was right. For now, she'd stay in the chapel a while longer, just until she could stand without trembling. The place had become more than shelter. It was the beginning of something neither of them expected, healing. And not just for her. The community found out eventually. A teenage snowplow driver saw the tire tracks leading to the church and went looking for answers. Word spread, but instead of panic, the town responded with wonder. People brought blankets, fresh meat. Someone donated a solar generator to keep the heater running. A church that hadn't hosted a service in over a decade became the center of quiet pilgrimage. Not for God, but for a lion. And the man who stayed beside her. Children left drawings at the chapel doors. An artist painted the lioness curled beneath the crucifix and hung it in the town's general store. A pastor from a nearby parish came and sat silently for hours, then left a note. Some angels walk on 4 legs. The story caught fire online. An anonymous post, then a local news segment. But Harold refused interviews. He wasn't interested in attention. His only concern was the lioness. And in caring for her, something inside him had started to thaw. By the 3rd week, she stood on her own. Still unsteady but proud, regal. She walked the chapel aisle slowly, almost reverently, brushing against the wooden pews as if she remembered the moment she first collapsed there. Harold watched her with silent awe, tears welling in eyes that had forgotten how to cry. Louise stood beside him, hand on his shoulder. "She's ready," she whispered. Harold nodded. "I'm not," he replied quietly. But he knew the truth. She had given him the courage to say goodbye to his grief, his guilt, and the years he'd spent in shadows. The morning of her departure, a van from the sanctuary arrived. It was quiet, discreet. The team moved with care and respect. No tranquilizers, no restraints. She walked into the padded crate on her own, head high. Before the doors closed, she turned back once, just a glance, and Harold stepped forward, placing his hand gently against the crate. "Thank you," he whispered. She didn't growl, didn't flinch, just blinked slowly, then turned away. And then she was gone, carried back into the wild world where she belonged. Harold stood alone in the chapel after they left. It felt empty again, but not hollow. There was something left behind in the stillness. A quiet strength. A memory in every footprint, every tuft of fur clinging to the robe she once slept on. He didn't cry. He just smiled, placed the last of the lioness's bedding in a cedar trunk and lit a single candle. Not for mourning, but for gratitude. The kind that comes when a soul, any soul, brushes yours and leaves you changed. He didn't stop visiting the chapel, but now he shared it. People came not to pray, but to feel close to the story, to remember that wildness and grace could coexist. Harold started volunteering at the sanctuary every week, helping with other rescued animals, wolves, foxes, even an old bobcat named Jude. He rebuilt the ranger in himself piece by piece, but this time with humility. He didn't need badges anymore. He had something better: belonging. Louise reopened her practice, and when people asked why, she simply said, "Because something fierce reminded me how to care again." Her friendship with Harold deepened. Not romance, something older, sturdier. Companionship forged in shared purpose. They never spoke much about the lioness. They didn't need to. She had left her mark on both of them, not with claws, but with grace. Months passed. The chapel became a sanctuary in every sense of the word. And Harold, who once came only to speak to a ghost, now came to listen, to the wind, the birds, the quiet footfalls of visitors. And sometimes, when the sunlight hit just right through the stained glass, he swore he could still see her shape curled beneath the altar. Not in body, in spirit. A reminder of the day everything changed. He didn't just save a lioness, she saved what was left of him.